All right, so we're recording.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Abigail Ogilvy of Abigail Ogilvy Gallery in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm going to be very brief today because I'm so excited to hear from our guests of honor, Michelle Millar Fisher and Coral Woodbury. This event will be recorded, and please at any time feel free to chime into the chat or ask questions with the Q&A. You can reply to everyone or just to the panelists. We will be doing questions at the end, but if there's a question that fits in nicely during, we'll definitely answer it right away. And then our assistant director, Kaylee Hennessy, will be moderating today. So I'm going to hand it over to her to do introductions.
Thanks, Abigail. Hi, everyone. My name is Kaylee Hennessy. As Abigail mentioned, I'm the assistant director here at Abigail Ogilvy Gallery in Boston, where I am at the moment. We are so excited to be joined in conversation with Michelle Millar Fisher and Coral Woodbury, who are here to talk about Coral's current solo exhibition, right behind me actually, a revised edition. So just to give you a brief background on each of our panelists, hailing from Scotland, Michelle Millar Fisher has worked as an educator, curator, and historian in universities and museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, and the MFA Boston, where she is currently the Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts. Her work focuses on the intersections of people, power, design, and craft. And then as a historian and an artist, Coral Woodbury critically reinterprets Western artistic heritage from a feminist perspective, bringing overdue focus and reverence to the long line of women artists who worked without recognition or enduring respect. Her work reclaims space for them, bringing women together across time and place in art that recasts and recrafts the story of art. Coral has long worked internationally, beginning with a residency in Italy with Rosenclair, her mentors for 30 years. She has been honored with a grant from the U.S. National Endowment for Humanities and has exhibited at opening press week of the 58th Venice Biennale, the Tarragon Museum, and an unsanctioned 00 Biennial de Havana in Cuba. In 2020, her work was selected for Area Code Art Fair, and she is represented by Abigail Ogilvy Gallery. So Michelle, I'd love to hand things off to you now, if you'd like to get us started.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kaylee and Abigail, for the lovely introductions. Carl, it's so nice to be with you. It's great to be in conversation. Thank you for having me as your interlocutor this evening. I'm so delighted. It's going to be a great conversation. We have about 45 minutes together. As Kaylee and Abigail said, if you have questions, don't be shy, pop them in the chat. We will get to them if we can do when we're looking through the slides, as we're going to do together just now. If they're a particularly in-depth question, we might save them till the end and really get into the meat then. I have about 10 questions here. And so, Carl, I'm going to ask you some of the things that I really was excited to know more about. You and I had a studio visit a couple of months ago. And, I love doing studio visits of all kinds, but very, very quickly within the first couple of minutes, I just really clicked with your work and we had this really wonderful conversation. So it's a treat tonight to be able to continue it. I'd love to ask, just to sort of kick us off, there may be people who've come along this evening who know your work really well, but for those who don't, can you describe your practice and sort of introduce yourself to folks?
Sure. Well, I didn't really set out to do this, but looking back across my life, this is what I have done. Whether it was in my studio practice or working in the museum field or teaching art history or working with the homeless and addicted populations, I think the common thread has been to give voice to the voiceless, to tend and repair what is broken, and to make visible what has been invisible. So in my studio practice, there's this sort of layering and interplay of these opposing truths and meanings from between the hidden and the revealed, the ephemeral and the lasting. If you want something succinct, I should stop there.
No, I don't actually. And I told a lie 2 seconds ago because I said I have 10 questions for you. I'm going to have at least 20, because each time you say something, I want to know more and it's not on my sheet. You said this is not what you set out to do. Like, when you, came into sort of consciousness of thinking about what life steps might be next as a teenager or in your early 20s, was being a painter or being an artist part of that? Or has it emerged in different ways at different stages in your life?
When I said that I hadn't set out to do that, it was sort of thematically, conceptually, the kinds of things that I'm interested in or exploring or have continued to work with, and not really realize that it's all the same question, all the same searching I've been doing. But I've wanted to be an artist for as long as I can remember. That doesn't mean I was always able to pursue this practice full time, and it has evolved and opened up over the course of my life in different ways.
While we're scene setting, can you tell us a little bit about where you are at the moment? Because I was totally blown away when I came into your studio. Can you describe it? And if you can tilt your camera just even a tiny bit to allow people in.
Let's see, I can't even see what I'm, you see, I have to fix my view so I know what you're seeing.
What I'm seeing behind
There we
you.
go. Okay, now I'm back, so I can I can tell what I'm showing you all. Let's see, a little view that way. My little kitchen corner and supply shelves, paintings and easels and cabinets and skylight. And actually, Kaylee, I don't know if the slides up.
The slides are up. Yes. Yeah. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. There we go. And there is a better view of it.
And this is in Providence, right, Coral?
Technically Pawtucket. So just slightly north in one of the old mill buildings. And Pawtucket was the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. So before urban renewal, it was all these old brick mill buildings, but this is one of the remaining ones, right by the Blackstone River. And you come up through what's now white hallways. But then if you recall, you get to the top floor and there's more to go. And there's a little narrow stairwell with a low ceiling door. It's very La Boheme minus the tuberculosis. It's really a garret studio. I'm up in the attic, but what is special about my space, I mean, there's lots of things special about my space, but that end wall, that brick wall that you see in the studio is actually the original exterior wall of the original mill building, but that floor was knocked down behind it. And so I am in the addition on the outside of the original wall. So I'm sort of inside and outside at the same time. And the original builders of this space have, if you look very, very closely, you can see their pencil signatures on some of the bricks.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic space. It was a treat to come and visit you in it. So I want to turn our attention to what we see on the right-hand side of the slide here. If people haven't been to see it, you can see it behind Kaylee, as we said, up at Abigail Ogilvy Gallery just now, and it's there for another week. So if you haven't been and you're in the Boston surrounds, I urge you to go take a look. But when I came to your studio, Coral, we talked about revised edition. We talked about the work that we can see on the slide just here. And it plays on the subtitle of lots of different art history textbooks like Jansen and Stockset that are very much the backbone of art history survey courses, ones that I've taught as well using these books. And they tell a very specific history. Can you talk a little bit about the series? And when was the first time that you came across one of these textbooks? When was the first time that you either held one in your hands, learned from one of them, or taught from one of them?
My first introduction to art history was as an undergraduate, and it just didn't occur to me that there were no women in the book at the time. It was a given. This was art history. And it wasn't until much later on, when I was in pursuing my own artistic practice, wondering, well, how have other women done this? How have they found their way forward? So I was looking for direction, and that is, that's really when I realized I don't know what the women artists have done. I don't really, I had familiarity with some of them certainly, but not to any sort of depth. And so I set about to re-educate myself, and realized that they needed to be in the books that they had been omitted from, and they were very, very consciously omitted. Jansen, this may be apocryphal, but from what I've heard, he literally said that women would not go in the text over his dead body. And it was after he died that women went in Jansen's History of Art, which was 1986. And in that first edition, I think there were only 6 women added. Now we're up to, I think, 33, and there are still a couple hundred men. Mm-hmm. So it's still quite imbalanced. But the series grew out of wanting to know these women, wanted to know their work, wanted to know who they were.
Kaylee, can you skip to the next slide now? Because it'd be really lovely to see one of these pages, or 2 of them. Brilliant, thank you, close up. So Coral, can you talk a little bit about your process of selection? Because there's multiple layers of selection at work here, right? You're thinking about the different pages of Stockstat. You're thinking about the different artists who you paint atop. So yeah, can you talk a little bit through how those choices are made?
Certainly. I meant to be more methodical in how I went about this. I started a spreadsheet, but I'm just an analog person, pencil and paper. I have not maintained the spreadsheet. So it's been very organic, very intuitive, very much led by my curiosity and by this serendipity. Who comes across my desk, my easel, my bookshelf, my feed. So there's a sort of constant influx of women artists. And then I also go looking, who am I not seeing? And so there's not as much of a system to it as I had intended, but there are too many to keep up with. I keep realizing, I haven't done Alice Neal yet. I haven't done, it just sort of keep occurring to me more and more artists that I want to look at, and also try to go and seek them out and learn in places that I might have missed. So when you asked about how do I fit them to the page, and that's actually the most labor intensive part of this, I think, probably because when I'm drawing them out or when I'm inking them, that doesn't feel like labor to me. But the selection process of really finding the right location for them within the book requires a lot of flipping back and forth between the pages and a lot of research about them, because I try to fit them in one of 3 ways. And one is aesthetically, what is the composition of the page that I'm looking at in terms of lights and darks and lines, and how those might connect in with the face, or what sort of interplay is there between the image of the face I've chosen. And I always try to find an image of the artist looking directly out if I'm able, because that eye contact is important. When you see a wall of women looking directly at you, there's sort of two parts of it. One is that it's a bit defiant and sort of maybe a little accusatory, a little confrontational. But for me, in the process of making it, it's much more intimate. It's about making eye contact. And this isn't how I would normally draw, which would be more of an all over development. But when I do these portraits, I always start with the eyes, because I need to see this person. And that eye contact is how we connect. So, all right, I went a little off topic there, but.
No, it's perfect.
So it's a matter of choosing space for them in the art history. So aesthetic and artistic choices is one way. Another might be art historical. What art history period do they fit into, and perhaps, or what geographic location do they fit into, or how does their own work relate to the work on the page? And I'm also limited by, I'm limited by the very limitations I'm attempting to overcome. There is no section of African art. There is no section on Asian art. And at a certain point, I'm going to be stuck with a lot of architecture. It gets harder and harder the more pages I've used to make a good connection. The last way I might make this selection is biographical. What do I know of this woman's story that has an echo in this page? So actually, there's two examples here with. I chose to put Carrie Mae Weems on Picasso's Guernica because of the way she has investigated cultural identity and class and political systems and the consequences of power. And also, of course, Picasso was an enormous sexist, and sexism is another thing she has dealt with in her own work. And then for Paula Modersohn Becker, I chose a page with the woman of Willendorf, which is largely conceived as a fertility talisman. And I chose that for Paula because of her own conflict and struggle concerning motherhood. She left her husband in Germany and moved to Paris to become an artist, and was gaining success in that, and did really revolutionary work. She was the first to painted a nude self-portrait as a woman. All the nude women in art history were not painted by women, and she painted herself. And then she painted herself as pregnant, even though she was not at the time pregnant, which this you all know. She established a measure of success in Paris and decided to return to her husband and then have a child, which she did, and then died 9 days later of a postpartum embolism. So there's a real, just such a tremendous loss in her story, and I wish I could have seen more of the work she would have gone on to make. So.
Me too, for sure, Coral. I feel like, her biography and her work are just so incredible and cut so short so quickly. When you're thinking of how to prioritize and how to give yourself parameters in the artists that you choose, what are the thoughts there? Because you cannot be comprehensive. No museum, no survey textbook is. There are always limits. There's always a subject position. There's a social location from which you are working as well. I think when you and I talked about this, these are not sort of surmountable challenges. These are parts of wrestling with what it is to think about what is erased, what is lost, and the way one sees histories versus the ways others see histories, and sort of the propensity for there always to be moments of ships passing in the night, or just different experiences or different subjectivities. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit more, because it really surfaced in our conversation. I really appreciated the ways in which you talked about it.
I don't remember how I talked about it, but I'll try again. This is actually, I think, this is the hardest thing for me, because I know I cannot succeed There is no possible way for me to make an equitable global study of art history. I'm too limited in my knowledge and in my location and in the pages of my book. I have considered different methods of how do I make this as equitable and as inclusive as possible. Should I, and this is where a spreadsheet might have helped. Should I make sure that the artists I paint are in parallel with the ethnic makeup of the United States, for instance, in the same percentages? But Jansen's was translated into 14 languages. Mm-hmm. And so, that wouldn't necessarily be reflective. And of course, those are sort of Western cultures that they were translated into. And then I thought, well, there's 100, it's generally recognized that we have 194 countries. Do I try to get one from each country? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, let's see, one artist from Tuvalu and one artist from France, and it just, how do I do this? I can't be both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So I know that I am perpetuating I'm perpetuating the same bias that I'm working against, and I'm painfully aware of that.
I would say I think you're being hard on yourself there, Coral. Actually, I think that I don't think you're perpetuating Jansen's bias in the slightest. I think that's the
same, but I have my own biases, and they're driven by my own knowledge, my own lack of knowledge, by my vision and my blind spots, by my own personal choices and passions and interests and curiosities. I do really try to balance my intake over diverse, from diverse sources. I try to seek out diversity when I look at my work and I'm not seeing enough of it. And I think I can only go forward believing that I can break open Jansen's to a certain degree, and then I hope the next person comes along and breaks open whatever I've been able to do to make it more equitable, more inclusive, and I welcome that and I look forward to that.
Yeah, no, I think the critical element is that you realize the subjectivity of your own history and your own sort of abilities and interests as the element of you that is a historian here alongside being an artist, in a way that Jansen and many other survey textbook writers in art history and in other disciplines simply did not. And so I think that is a nuance, but the critical nuance is sort of the hinge upon which this series is so successful. I wanted to ask a sort of a meta question, looking at Carrie Mae Weems and Paula Modersohn Becker, these two amazing women identifying artists. And you have had a really, really amazing career, and it's really sort of spanned different disciplines, different areas, different modes of practice. Have you felt that the arc of your career as a woman identifying artist has been supported? If so, how? And if not, how? When has it felt like it has been something that has really been able to sing and move forward? And when has it not felt like that?
Well, I don't think it's easy to make an artistic path forward no matter who you are. But then I look at the data and it is preposterously easier to do it as a white man. Yes. Inarguably, the data reveals that to us. Yes. So I got out of school, undergraduate, with an art degree and really no idea how that was supposed to become a career. I had none of the tools. I could use a paintbrush, but I hadn't even been taught how to take proper slides because it was still slides and slide carousels at the time, or where I was to go with my painting or who would look at them, and nobody really. So it was many years and a long meandering path. I was incredibly fortunate to have these mentors that I studied with, but there was a 20-year gap while I was building a career and also becoming a mother. And I think becoming a mother is when the sort of inherent conflict became just glaringly apparent. How, you know, motherhood is like the last taboo in art. You know, we have explored sex and sexuality everywhere, but not the result of that. Where did all these artists come from? And as a mother, I was told straight out directly, don't let on that you have children because you will not be seen as a professional. You can't be both an artist and a mother. If you're a mother, you're an amateur painter, you're a hobbyist. And so I think that's deeply problematic, this continued silence around motherhood and art. And I mean, our image of motherhood is still 500-year-old Renaissance paintings of the Madonna. And you know, it's not really like that. So I think that's something that became really clear, and it was incredibly difficult to maintain any kind of artistic practice with children. You just kind of keep going, but perhaps ironically, in the end, what has been successful in my work has been looking at this very problem. Mm-hmm. And a result of my work is a result of that struggle and that searching for a way forward as a woman and as a mother, and then I think the success of the work has been a result of that same struggle because it resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to affirm two things you said there before I move on to my next question. I don't know if anyone has looked at the reports that Charlotte Burns and Julia Halpern did for art agency partners over the last couple of years. In 2018, I think it was, they looked at the intersections of race in the contemporary art world. And they're two really fantastic journalists. They have access to a lot of very important people in the art world, including most directors. And so they were able to approach major curators and directors across the US and beyond, and to ask them about collecting patterns in the past and present, but also future strategies for diversifying collections along the intersection of race in terms of acquisitions, in terms of display. I think this also should be asked around staffing in museums, but they were really thinking about the contemporary art world and artists. And they were able to come to some really critical understandings of the ways in which there was, a lack of diversity and the ways in which that was being addressed or not addressed and how it should be. They came back the year after, which I think was 2019, and they asked the same questions about gender. And where museum directors and curators have been falling over themselves to answer the question about racial diversity in their collections, when they were asked about gender parity in their collections, almost universally, none of them responded to the email inquiry. None of them responded to the first phone call. And when they had conversations, eventually Charlotte and Julia got in touch and had conversations. They said, I don't really think this is as much of a problem. It's not as much of a burning issue. We know from many other forms of data that women, and especially women of color, get the shortest end of a very short stick. And so again, it's worth reading their report because Charlotte and Julia were able to talk about how small the slice of the pie is for contemporary female artists in the art market, for example. I think it's something ridiculous, like 2% of the major sales include big figures by women artists. And that is also part of and I go back to staffing in museums and galleries. And I'm so pleased to be in a gallery this evening that is female owner, female led and female run at Abigail Ogilvy. But there's a clear divide in the US between museums with operating budgets of over $15 million, which are predominantly run by men, and operating budgets with under $15 million, which is where you start to see female directors. There are, of course, exceptions in each place, but the predominance is if you have a large operating budget, a larger museum, men are in charge. And so it's like, it's not brain science then to understand how there is a real lack of gender parity and how that question really isn't seen as something that is a priority or even real. In the same way as other questions of diversity and intersections that are also incredibly important are as well. So yeah, I just wanted to affirm both of those things.
Thank you for bringing that to the fore.
But so what you're saying is so correct, Coral. I also want to point out like that there is an art history which has, you know, it's a rich one that has looked at motherhood in some ways. Mary Kelly, I think of, Carmen Winant more recently. But then I'm also keenly aware, I was chatting to another artist, Amy Gilmour, whose work I followed in Philadelphia for some time. And when she was 6 weeks postpartum, actually, when she started her MFA a couple of years ago. And so one of her professors came into her studio for a studio visit during her MFA and picked up her breast pump that was sitting on her desk and said, "What is this, an air horn?" And she was like, are you out of your mind? Like you obviously have no idea what this is. I mean, you have kids. I'm sure you've probably seen one in the not too distant past. But she said she was firmly discouraged from making any kind of work about motherhood. And indeed, as you say, from mentioning that she was a mother, that this was something that could in some way form part of her everyday life or part of her practice. So that brings me to my question, Coral, because when we spoke, you talked about mentors, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the mentorship that you've had, because it's such a powerful thing in somebody's career and in somebody's life, and you've had really great mentorship. So could you talk a little bit about it?
Absolutely. 30 years ago, I landed in Florence for a semester study abroad, and it was those two teachers. They team teach and work together as an artist duo. It's Rose Shakanowski and Claire Gobronski, and they work together as Rose and Claire. And what was phenomenal in their teaching, and unlike anything else that I've experienced, is a focus not only on the technique, but on the underpinning philosophies. Why do we do this? Why does this matter? And you know, after undergraduate, I did a summer workshop with them just that following year, and then just stayed in touch with them even over years that over 20 years I wasn't able to return or to work with them in any kind of intensive way. But in the past year, because of the pandemic, they brought their workshops online to Zoom. And so through those, I've been able to reconnect with some people I haven't seen in 30 years. And you know, in the last, I did a drawing residency the week my show went up. And these are super intensive, you know, working in the morning in lecture and lessons, and then drawing until midnight. But there were 48 of us from 10 different countries. And it is such a blessing to be part of a group, part of a community that understands each other in this way and is working for the same reasons and to the same purpose, and has become a support network that I certainly wish I had been able to be in touch with earlier on in more difficult years, trying to find my way and really needing that support. But you know, it's a beautiful thing to reach I'll be 50 this year. And to look back and realize that this, I don't know if there's anything like it in the art world now. I think you would really call it a movement. And really just beautiful, generous people, and all practicing together. And now we pop into the Zoom studio together. It's been, I'm so blessed. I really am very lucky.
Community is so incredibly important. I feel like that's been, I don't want to, I mean, a silver lining is difficult because it's been such a horrific year and such a deadly and horrific year for so many people. But being able to reach out across usual boundaries has been, if we can call it that, a silver lining. I know that we're getting close. We've had about 30 minutes. I know we've got about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to say two things. If anyone has questions, start thinking about them. You're very welcome to put them in the chat. And Kaylee, could we take a look at some of the very final slides that we have? Coral, I'd love you to talk a little bit about what we have in the slides in the final few after Carrie and Paula. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about what we're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen. Actually, we have another portrait of Helma on the left, which we'll come to in a second. But can you talk a little bit about how you've sort of expanded your interest in, or the concept behind, Revised Edition? Because it's taken several different forms. It's on the pages of Jansen, but it's also in other ways too.
Certainly. This sort of miniature painting grew out of, well, what happened was that painting on the inks in Jansen made my oil portraits somehow redundant. They needed to be on the pages of the art history text, and that's really where I sort of got to know their faces. And then in my oil painting, I started to think about, and this I think you relate to perhaps through your museum background, but we're both lovers of material culture. I have been my whole life, and it's one of the things that sent me into the museum field. And I believe in the stories that objects have to tell, and the connection that they make over time. And so I started to look at the belongings of women artists. And this actually ties back to some earlier work that I had done about, or looking at articles of clothing that were sort of both, they were anthropomorphic. They represented the body, but there was a real absence. And so this is a continuation of that examination. And I've started to look for the objects that belong to these women artists. And sometimes I'm zooming in on a photograph to something really, really tiny and blowing it up. But how are these objects then themselves portraits of a particular person? And there's something really intimate about these objects, I find, as a way of seeing that person.
Absolutely. I love that they are material traces of somebody's life. That the parts, as you say, especially when you are zooming in on these tiny, tiny details that are otherwise overlooked. And I think it's a form of resistance in and of itself to insist upon the biographical. I also think material culture is something that's overlooked often. It's sort of seen as secondary in fine art circles. But especially when it comes
to— Because it was predominantly women's. It was the decorative arts was the realm of women, and so it was not
absolutely
fine art.
Absolutely. So. And then just the notion of resisting, I mean, at least when I was going through art history courses in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was inheriting, the 80s and 90s art history, which was about sort of a real insistence on theory, still hadn't really escaped the formalism of the mid 20th century. And biography was seen somehow as lesser than in terms of interpreting the context of a work. And so especially when it came to women, women could be written off actually in terms of their biographies. That context could be used to diminish their work in many ways. And I remember feeling quite powerfully that I could, burn that section of my art history teaching when I saw the Louise Bourgeois show in 2008 at the Guggenheim. And it was so perfect because her work was so powerful just as an experience wandering into the museum, but also completely and utterly intertwined in terms of her life and the material culture that had defined it. And so I love this aspect of your work, Coral, because it really refuses on so many levels the ways in which traditional art histories have given value to works and to artists and what they make. Can we look at the next slide, Kaylee?
Thank you for articulating that so beautifully.
Oh, I mean, from the conversation that we had when we were at your studio visit. So this, I remember walking into your studio, and I'm excited to see it in person again because it was just in the last stages of being finished. So it's, again, you can see it just behind Kaylee now. But it's also something I know really well from its echo in the MFA's collection. So can you talk a little bit about what we're looking at here?
Certainly. So part of my questioning, my looking for the women in art history was also looking at the women in art, and feeling that they needed to be, that space needed to be opened up for them. And I started thinking about how art would be different, how art history would be different with women artists in place. And then of course we have one of Boston's favorite paintings. And I was sitting looking at it, and it's sort of came to me almost as like a double exposure in my mind, how that would look if it wasn't the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. What would it look like if there were women artists brought together in that space? So this is a grouping of women artists across time and across place, all brought together.
And you have Ruth Asawa, Vanessa Bell, but then I didn't actually know, and I had to look up before we had our conversation, the biographies of the other two artists that are here, Theslev and Vincenzo. And so how did you decide that it was going to be these four artists that you wanted to profile here? Again, were you looking at them as part of the series on Jansen pages at the time, or was it something that just sort of as you were painting it came?
This actually preceded the Jansen series. The way this came about was actually, it was Vincenzo, who's the one seated on the rug, was looking at the Sargent painting in the MFA, and I had just been looking at lots of images of women artists, and I sort of saw her sitting on the rug. It was sort of a bolt of inspiration or something. So I started with her because nobody else could. I don't have many photos of artists in that particular position, and she was just
perfect. She fit the bill.
She just fit. And I tried to bring in a diversity of women, different places, different time periods, different approaches, different sort of gender orientations, and tried to bring a group of differing women together. But also they were just women I was looking at the time. It was, again, sort of an intuitive, organic process. And these are the women who showed up in my space.
And then what are we looking at on the right-hand side here?
Okay, so this actually relates even though in time period it was more recent, it relates to the earlier body of work I was just mentioning. I was so deeply affected by RBG's death. I think we were all really despairing of what would come after that, and this was just my own response to that loss, to that, and also a way of honoring her contributions and her strength and her brilliance. And but it was important to me to, I selected the earliest article, the earliest photograph of her I could find. She was 2 years old, and to portray her in this child's dress, and thinking about who she became and what she did for all the girls who came after her. So again, it's important to me to show, to think about, to see her as a person in this very vulnerable child's dress. It just spoke to me of who she was and who she became and what she gave us.
We're almost at the end of our time, Coral. I want to ask you, what's next? Like, what are the things that you're excited about when you sit in the studio and you're thinking about the next thing you're going to do? What is it that you're really sort of percolating on at the moment?
There's always so much I want to do and just not enough time. Well, there's some things I'm working on shortly to bring to the Newport Art Museum.
Fantastic.
For the show this summer called Call and Response, which for me is a super exciting project where I get to go back into the museum collection. So it's sort of coming full circle, and delving into the storage and just in heaven, and making all the connections between this and that, and what's here and what's not here, and the jumble that museum collections can be, just treasure houses. And of course, I'm approaching it from the women artists, responding to the women artists in the collection. And the thing that resonated most with me was the base for a sculpture by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. I worked at the Newport Mansions years ago, and but now I have the chance to consider her as an artist. And also perfect, the sculpture was stolen, and so all that remains of it is the base. So I'm once again working with issues of loss, but it's combining with the stories of a woman artist. And so I'm recreating the sculpture, but in drawings and paintings, layers of things.
So it's another form of repatriation. I love it, Coral. It's great.
Yes.
Perfect.
And I hope, we've talked about this, I hope to see this revised edition series actually be a book. And I would like, because there's one copy of it that is being dispersed as people purchase it. I'd love to see it come together. My dream would be to see it all together at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. But more democratically, I'd like to see it available in a book. And then I'm also working towards a solo show at Hacklebury Fine Art in London this fall. So it's a busy year.
When does Newport open, Coral?
Opens in May.
Okay. That's exciting.
May 20th or something like that. So I'm really getting there. I have to deliver it May 12th. So we're getting close.
No, I think the revised edition deserves to be in book form too. I think it would make an absolutely fantastic publication. So I have my fingers crossed for that.
Well, I'm counting on you to do the writing. So
I'm in. I'm definitely in.
Excellent.
And I just think it's something I hope will become part of conversations in art history classrooms, in art history studios. I think this sort of revision, recalibration, reconsideration of history is something that is so entirely necessary, and something that your work does so powerfully. And
Thank you.
I'm excited to bring it in when I'm teaching as well, to conversations we're having in the classroom.
Oh, I look forward to that.
I want to make sure we're kind of, and I'm going to be very careful with time. Yeah, we're almost exactly on time. If there's any questions that folks have, now is a good time to ask. I'm looking through the chat just here. Oh, and Sarah has a very nice point. It's very true. Love the reference, Coral, to the National Museum of Women in the Arts, certainly tied to Wilhelmina Holliday's realization that there were no women artists in Janssen's art history. So very, very true. Well, if no one has any questions, then Coral, I'm just going to say thank you so very much for spending time talking about your work and allowing me to be an interlocutor of it. Keely, I hand it back to you with very great thanks to you and Abigail for having us.
Thank you, Michelle. And we actually did get a separate audience question for Coral. They asked, are there any artists that you've discovered while creating this revised edition series that have informed your practice a little bit more, or maybe inspired you in a way that you weren't inspired before you set out on this project?
At the moment, I'm hard pressed to name and in one single individual. I think I sort of think their strength is in each other. You know, it's all of them. Every single one of them has in one way or another, you know, been able to move beyond the sort of constraints and repression of being a female artist. Every single one of them has dealt with that, and yet found a way to remain true to who they were and to their work. So
I love that you,
all of them.
and I also love that you refuse to anoint one great artist with a capital G and a capital A. Like, that's perfect. That's the way it should be.
You're great.
Michelle, I wanted to thank you. It's been really great to talk to you again. Lovely conversation. Thank you so much. And Kaylee and Abigail for making it possible. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's so important to have these conversations. It's really, really necessary. I think I sit often with, and in fact it is within reaching distance of Adrian Rich's of Woman Born. And I'm going to paraphrase her, but she says something that I come back to a lot, that if we don't tell each other about our experiences, we'll go slightly insane. And it's really important to see the sum total of these experiences, because of course they're always unique, but they're also intersecting and overlapping. And if we are not going to tell each other about them, then they become lost to history, and then history doesn't change. And so I think it's really, really important to have a conversation like this, to have artists making work like you're making it, Coral, and to have women running and founding galleries and putting it on display. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, also we need to highlight the book that just came out of yours, I believe this week, Designing Motherhood.
Just going to the printer this week, so it'll be coming out shortly. But yeah, Designing Motherhood, which looks at the arc of human reproduction through the lens of design. So lots of similar stories of erasure, of women identifying people who have really changed the course of history in terms of the way we come into the world through birth. And many, many different histories of design that myself and my writing partner, Amber Winnick, were really delighted to kind of highlight and to publish. So yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Coral and Michelle, I have to thank you both so much for being here. I know personally this was a dream conversation for me to be able to sit in on and finally hear. So thank you both. To the audience, thank you all so much for joining us today. Coral's show Revised Edition will be on view at the gallery through April 25th. So stop by if you have the time. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to answer. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.